First will be Deborah Lyles. She's an assistant professor and the W.K. Gordon Chair of Texas History at Tarleton State University. She earned her Ph.D. at the University of North Texas, where she examined the antebellum livestock trade and its relationship to the institution of slavery. Her recent books include the two edited anthologies, Texas Women and Ranching, On the Range, At the Rodeo, in the Community, which won the Liz Carpenter Award from the Texas State Historical Association, and African Americans in Central Texas History from Slavery to Civil Rights. Her former co-edited book, Women in the Civil War Texas, Diversity and Dissidence, also won the Liz Carpenter Award for Best Book on Texas Women's History. So thank you for your attendance, and we have Deborah Lyles on a Zoom presentation. So take it away.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And before I start, I'd like to say that I'm sorry for any dog barking that may go on in the background. I have two labs, and they're very active outside. So if you hear anything, just ignore them. So I would like to talk to you today about Martha Alice Loring, who was a cattlewoman, a banker, a wife, and a mother. And I found her quite by accident when I was doing some different research. And she's one of those rabbit holes that you kind of run down, and you find out that she has a really interesting story also. So let me set you up. Upon returning home to Cook County from Missouri, where he and his wife Martha had been betting on the horse races, John Loring met his unfortunate demise. Unsatisfied with how slowly his one-armed slave Jack was cutting wood, John, in a drunken state, began to whip Jack. Somehow the whip, and Jack's axe became entangled, and the axe struck John's head, mortally wounding him. Instead of seeking revenge against the slave, the newly widowed Martha testified the whole affair was an accident, and one-armed Jack's life should be spared. As a result, the grateful man stayed with Martha for the rest of her life, even after the end of the war. Now, how much of this is true and how much is folklore has yet to be determined. It is true, however, that John Loring died, and Martha was left to care of her 9 children. Martha Alice Landers was the oldest daughter of Clark and Sarah Hayes Landers. She was born in Fort Smith, Arkansas on October the 17th, 1816. Little is known about her early life other than approximately 2 years after her first marriage ended to John Sutherland, she married John Nathaniel Loring. Loring was born on January 28, 1807, in Paris, Kentucky, and Martha was his second wife. John first appeared in the property tax records of Fannin County, Texas in 1843, suggesting that they arrived somewhere within the previous year. This would be their home for approximately 13 years. Now, these are property tax records where I do a lot of my research, and so here's John Loring listed right here. This is the land he owned. These are the slaves, the horses, and the livestock. So John owned 1,940 acres of land the year before he, Martha, and their children and slaves moved approximately 75 miles west to Cook County. That same year, 1856, he also declared 9 slaves, 15 horses, and 30 head of cattle. Between the time he filed his taxes in Fannin County and the time they were due in Cook County, John died, and Martha was left to fend for herself in a new location, removed from the familiarities of Fannin County and any friends or ties she may have formed there over a decade. Martha's property taxes, again, set up the same way. Martha's property taxes create the impression that initially she was not as savvy as her husband in the ranching industry. The first year she declared taxable property was as an administrator for her deceased husband. So here she is, administrator, basically declaring his property. Along with 1,307 acres on the Clear Fork branch of the Trinity River, she paid taxes on 9 slaves, indicating that the Lorings brought all of their slave people with them from Fannin County. Her 14 horses, worth $700, and 700 head of cattle, worth $1,800, was indicative of the opportunities livestock offered in Cook and other frontier counties at the time, and suggests that the initial move was for John to take part in this industry. John's untimely death made Martha the second largest rancher and 5th largest slave owner in the county. biological accounts, it appears that John left his widow in an enviable position, and all she had to do to comfortably survive was manage it. But was that really the case? Loring was familiar with livestock before he and his family moved to Cook County, but not in the traditional sense. Several newspaper excerpts point to John's involvement in horse racing on more than a casual level. By 1854, John's declaration of 58 horses worth $2,330 clearly shows his investment in the industry. Suffice to say, the money involved in this horse racing activities was significant, and that Loring traveled to racetracks in multiple locations, which makes the trip to Missouri right before his death a conceivable event. As John's involvement with racing continued, Martha's level of participation is undocumented. The regularity with which their offspring arrived suggests that her time was filled with raising children, not betting on the horses, although she may have accompanied John from time to time. When they moved to Cook County in 1856, there were 9 Lorings living at home. Thaddeus was 16, Nancy 14, Clark 13, Amanda 11, John 8, Thomas 6, Alice 4, William 2, and finally, there was the newborn Bruce. John died on February the 12th, 1857, leaving Martha to begin the process of paying the bills and handling the estate. Along with the first was a $20 doctor's fee for attendance during John's last illness. There was also an unspecified amount paid to William Downing for a coffin. Martha's property tax records the next 2 years reflects a sharp decline in her cattle holdings. One instinctively presumes that she was unable to manage the stock John had accumulated before he died, as the total drops from 700 head to 217 in 1858, and then down to 259. Although these numbers were less than the 57 total and were by no means a small or unsuccessful ranching operation at the time, they were actually far more than she inherited. An appraisal of the estate conducted on June the 26th, 1857, shows much about Martha's involvement in the livestock industry and other aspects of her business sense. There were 9 mules, 3 horses, and 117 head of cattle, along with 7 yoke of oxen and 20 hogs listed in John's possessions, along with 1,420 acres, 4 slaves, a new wagon, plow, and miscellaneous implements. His estate was valued at $7,105. This is relevant information that I will revisit in just a minute. Expenses included payment in kind, including unpaid debts from their former Fannin County life, as well as their new home in Cook County. Along with bills due for supplies in Fannin and Cook counties, she paid William and Dick Stevens to do $65 worth of carpentry work on the new house on February 28th, and Mr. Morrison $28 to dig a new well in August of 58. She paid Lem Gooding $4.78 for school supplies and $20 to James Shegog to teach the children in 57. There were several bills for blacksmithing, farrier services, and one for $100 for the use of 2 wagons and teams that went to Shreveport and back during the winter of 1858. The drivers on this venture were Thaddeus Loring, her oldest son, and John Brawley, who had married Nancy, her oldest daughter. Martha had undoubtedly known Brawley for years before she married Nancy on December the 21st, 1856, as they were neighbors in Fannin County. Listed as another Cook County stock raiser in 1860, he was the recipient of a $450 cash advance, which is approximately $10,000 in today's money, from Martha in January 1858. As the widow of nearly 2 years, with 8 of her children still living at home, it is important to note that Martha had available funds to lend. I'll come back to this a little later. With the reduced number of livestock in her 58 and 1859 property taxes, without the appraisal of John's estate to consider, it can easily be assumed that Martha was obtaining money to support her family by selling the stock John accumulated before he died. While it is true that she was selling some stock, the report for final settlement in the estate of John Loring shows that Martha was also contributing to her family's support as a moneylender. Before John died, his property taxes reflected his engagement in this business. In 1852, he declared $1,000 of money at interest. In 1854, $1,500, and in 1855, $2,000. Martha collected $890 in 1858, which may have well been balances on notes that John had made before he died. But new loans and collections in following years suggest it was her, not John, who had enough disposable cash to engage in money lending during their marriage, and it certainly was after he died. By 1860, Martha's declaration on her property tax reflected a growth worth considering. When John died, 4 slaves were listed as his. So here's your, this is your slave census right here. And they came around and did different slave census as well as other census records during the 1850s and 60s. And here's John listed right here, and here's Martha listed right here with her enslaved property. When John died, 4 slaves were listed as his: 2 black women who were 20 and 16, a 3-year-old mulatto girl, and a 6-month-old mulatto child. But he declared 9 slaves on his Fannin County taxes. In 1857, Martha reported the same 9 slaves, and by 1860, she owned 11. The ages of the slaves on the 1860 Schedule 2, which is right here, indicate that 3 of John's slaves were still with her, but that 16-year-old woman, who would now have been 20, was not. Martha was listed as the owner of 7 female slaves who varied from age 4 to 30 years old. That John did not list 5 of the 9 slaves he reported on his taxes suggests they were Martha's property all along, not his. Clark Landers, Martha's father, owned 5 slaves in 1840, and it is quite possible that she inherited some or all of them when she died. Incidentally, this would include the 29-year-old black man who was also probably Jack, the slave whose axe accidentally killed John. Is this why she stood up for him? Had Jack been a part of her life for more years than John? Even if testimony is found about what happened that day, John died. About what happened the day John died, this and many other questions will probably not be answered definitively. Aside from the slave value, Martha's livestock holding deserves attention. As the difference between John's declaration of slaves, it is entirely possible that the livestock John reported throughout the years were also not his. The appraisal of his 117 head of cattle after he died does not come close, and you can see right here Martha's livestock holdings right in this area. Does not come close to the 700 head of cattle she paid property taxes on as her first year as the widow, much less the 30 head he claimed before he left Fannin County. To further support the concept that it was Martha, not John, who was involved in the livestock industry, by 1861, 5 years after John's death, she reported 800 head of cattle worth $5,800, which is approximately $138,000 in today's money. This made her the 4th largest rancher in Cook County out of over 50 people who reported 100 head of cattle or more. While John was alive, he intermittently reported large holdings of horses, but after he died, Martha did not make considerable increases in the number of horses she owned. Instead, she invested in cattle. As it did for hundreds of thousands of people, the Civil War changed Martha's life forever. On February the 15th, 1862, Martha's oldest child, Thaddeus, mustered in as a private in Johnson's regiment, Texas Mounted Volunteers. He was 21 years old and enlisted for 12 months with a $100 horse and $25 in equipment. Johnson's Mounted Volunteers, briefly known as the 14th Texas Cav, was arranged by Tarrant County planner Middleton Tate Johnson, who helped select the original location for Fort Worth with Ripley Arnold in 1849. His regiment of 10 companies was mainly made up with men from North Texas. In March 1862, the regiment was dismounted at Little Rock, Arkansas, and then reorganized May the 8th before it went to fight in Farmington, Mississippi just 20 days later. It is unknown if Thaddeus experienced any combat, but one can imagine how Martha felt when he became ill, probably with the measles, and died many miles away from her and his home. On February the 25th, 1862, 10 days after Thaddeus had mustered in, Martha married Isaac Moore. By July the same year, Martha reported she had hired out Anne, a Negro woman, and 4 children, all unable to support themselves. That was a direct quote. For a period of 20 months at $8 per month. The enslaved woman had been in John's appraisal, but missing in Martha's holding in the 1820 slave census. It was also mentioned in the report. Lucy, as she was known, was part of a trade to Dr. Polly shortly after John died for 300 head of cattle worth $6 each. Since Lucy had been appraised at $1,000 when John died, the act of trading for stock made the transaction beneficial to both Martha and Dr. Polly, although it may not have been beneficial to Lucy. Out of the 300 head of cattle Martha received, she sold 41 of them for an average of $17.70 each, or a total of $725.70. Had she sold the remaining cattle involved in the trade for the same price, she would have made an additional $4,584, or a profit on the overall transaction of $3,510. Martha's decision to trade John's slave for livestock shortly after she became a widow was an excellent business decision for her and demonstrates her knowledge of the livestock business. Martha continued to support reports to the court as the administrator of the heirs of John Loring. An account of the probate court in 1863 tells much about her involvement in management of her children's portion of the property. She reported an income of $3,367 over the past year, approximately $64,000 in today's money, and also it should be noted that a Confederate soldier was making $12 a month, or at that time, or approximately $300 a year, and she reported $3,300 that year. Out of that, $900 was for the sale of 30 beef steers. The rest was from payments on notes, including $920 in interest, or $320 in interest, excuse me. Outgoing money totaled $2,551. Included in that were payments for Amanda, Alice, William, and Bruce's schooling, and merchandise needed by the family. The largest outgoing expense was for 300 head of cattle bought from J. Fox for $2,100, another example of her involvement in the livestock industry. In 1866, the year after the war ended, Martha and Isaac reported their taxes to James Shegog, the man who had previously taught her children. They had 1,929 acres worth $4,200, 10 horses worth $300, and 1,500 head of cattle worth $7,500. And then they also had miscellaneous property worth $350, which were extremely large holdings compared to many of the other residents in the county, especially after the Civil War. While many historians report that cattle were just wandering around in Texas during the war years, unattended and waiting for a war veteran to round up and drive them north when they returned, Martha and Isaac's figures are one of many that show that the livestock industry was not abandoned during the war, and that many residents in Texas saw and profited from their continued participation in the industry before the war ended. One other item of interest in the 1866 property tax records is found in the detailed notes beside the 12 names of men reporting their property. The tax assessor collector and James Shegog took the time to make a notation of those who were freedmen. See right here? One was John Loring, the slave who had killed John, her husband. Along with other things, it is interesting to note that he kept the Loring name and that he remained in Cook County until Martha moved to Clay County, when then he was also listed there. None of the men, unsurprisingly, had any property to report, so they only paid $1 fee for the poll tax and 50 cents for the county tax. By the following year, not one of those freedmen was listed in the tax records. It is not known exactly when Isaac died, only that it was in 1868. The statement in his probate records contained no month or day of the year, only that he had died and that Martha was once again a widow and, after court proceedings, an administrator for her husband's estate. This time, she was the sole heir. A $61 bill for 53 days of boarding from September 22nd to November 14th, 1868, was paid to an unknown recipient for what surely was time away from home during Isaac's final illness. Along with this, there are the same kind of debts she had to pay after John's death, although not as many. Dr. M.A. Elliott was paid $144, but no coffin was listed. There was only one bill for merchandise, including only one bill for merchandise and a debt to her son-in-law, John Bewley, listed here as Bailey, for $1,399. When all was said and done, the amount she paid out, including court costs and interest, exceeded the amount of funds that came in, a reversal of fortunes compared to her life as a single woman during the years after John's death and her marriage to Isaac. After paying these debts, Martha also had to renew surety bonds against the property of John Loring's estate. The stress of dealing with the affairs of two deceased husbands and that of Thaddeus was surely immense. When she paid the property tax in 1869, a clerical error, and you can see her right here, but I blew it up right here for you. A clerical error had her listed as Martha A. Martha. This aside, the newly widowed Martha reported 2,300 acres valued at $2,380, 5 horses worth at $200, 1,000 head of cattle worth $4,000. As when John Loring died, the figures on her new taxes do not reflect her husband's estate. Isaac's property appraisal included a town lot valued at $800, 320 acres, and 200 head of cattle worth $700. Martha's taxes indicate she not only had property on her own that she did not report throughout her marriages, but that she continuously was active in the livestock business throughout her marriages to both John and Isaac. Martha is a perfect example of how hard it is to trace early women's history, much less add them to the ranching history of the state. In 1850, before John died, Martha was listed as a resident in the Loring household with no profession. After moving to Cook County, she reported taxes as a Loring, as a Moore, and thanks to a clerical error as a Martha. In the 1870 census, just 2 years after Isaac Moore's death, she was listed as Martha Loring, but in the 1860 census, down here, she was listed as M.A. Moore, and her profession was finally listed as has stock. She died 3 years later, and even though she was identified as a Moore in the last census, her headstone does not reflect any relationship to Isaac, as it reads Martha, wife of John Loring, born October the 17th, 1816, died December the 5th, 1883. The stone was probably a decision of her children or other relatives, but adds to the complication. With men's history, it is one last name all the time, creating a record that is much easier to trace. With women, aside from clerical errors, complete omission from the records, misrepresentation in records, and lost records, the simple changing of a last name is an added opportunity to lose track of not only their contributions, but also the role they played in the overall history. Martha's story here is by no means complete, but it was never intended to be. This study began as a side note in a chapter about women ranchers, not as a biography of a specific woman. Her name stood out because I also made a clerical error right here. I also made a clerical error and mistakenly transcribed her entry as a slave owner in Cook County in the property taxes as Martha Loving, not Loring. She originally caught my eye because of my interest in research about Oliver Loving, a cattleman in Parker and Palapino counties. The hunt for more material to add to the Women Rancher chapter led to the discovery of a woman's life that could very well have been omitted. The point is simply this: women were part of ranching history. They were often agents in their own success, and they were very capable of navigating their lives in what is traditionally and wrongly assumed only to be a man's world. Martha Alice Lander Sutherland Loring Moore's life was fraught with challenges, but she continuously rose to the occasion, as did many other women. She used non-traditional means, such as money lending and ranching, to provide for her large family, to educate her children, and to navigate life as a widow and a married woman. How many other Marthas are missing from the histories of early Texas will surely never be known, but what is known from this very short study is that many were a vital component of the economic machine in those early years of settlement, and that more work needs to be done to include their voices in the historical record. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Really very nice. Our next speaker is Amy Porter, who's been with us for almost every conference we've had, but she adds so much with her broad perspectives. We can't get enough of Amy's work. She's a professor of history at Texas A&M University, San Antonio, where she teaches classes on early America and Texas. She received her PhD in history from SMU. Porter's research examines women in the Spanish borderlands. Her 2015 book entitled Their Lives, Their Wills, Women in the Borderlands, 1750 to 1846, was a co-winner of the Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca Prize from the Historical Society of New Mexico. She's published research in the Handbook of Texas, as well as other books and journals. She's currently co-authoring a textbook for Mexican American Studies, and so thrilled you're here again with us.
Thank you. I was looking for my glasses, so if you see me squinting, that's what's going on there. Not sure. They're just reading glasses. No worries. No, it's okay. I'll make do. It's okay. I don't think I need my notes. Really interesting following Deborah's presentation here. There's some interesting connections, I think, between her work and mine. I'm working in an earlier period of time, but what I'm not going to talk about today, but what piqued my interest when she's talking about the money lending. A lot of the women that I look at in my studies are also involved in money lending, or that's maybe more formal than what's going on. You know, they're noting in their wills that they have lent household items, or they might list a money amount, but they had actually lent people some animals or the use of some land or things along those lines. So it's always wonderful to be at a conference where you can think about your own research and connections to other people's in different ways, I think. Here, what you see in these images are images of the Rancho de las Cabras, which I'll talk about a little bit today. In English, it's the goat ranch, but Las Cabras sounds so much better, I think. I have an image of an old newspaper article and then a photograph I took years ago when I was there on the site, and I'll return to that in just a minute. Okay. So I want to start by providing a little bit of context here to help you all understand this story before I dive into the women specifically. You know, I think as Texans, we have really set ideas about what ranching is, and some of that applies to this period of time, and some of it doesn't. Of course, cattle were really important in Texas, and I think that's what we tend to think of when we think of Texas ranches. But of course, I just started by showing you all the Rancho de las Cabras. So it's going to be more than cattle. Sheep and goats will be important also. What's going to happen in Texas when the Spanish first arrive, when expeditions travel through the area, they will leave behind animals, livestock, to breed, or some escape from these expeditions. And what happens is that over time they breed in the wild. And the cattle in particular did really well. So that when Spanish return to certain areas to settle, they're finding fairly large herds of wild cattle. And they've started to breed in specific ways. The horns start to get a bit longer because the mothers can better protect their young out in this environment. So we have the beginnings of the Texas Longhorn. Although again, I think the image you have in your mind of the Texas Longhorn is not quite what it looked like at this time. There's some more breeding that needs to take place to get there. Then we have the Spanish missions moving into the area, and the presidios as well, but I'm going to focus on the missions because they're involved in ranching. And those missions have a lot of land. So specifically when the missions are in their more or less final destinations along the San Antonio River, these ranch lands will be assigned to the missions, and the missionaries will claim some of these wild cattle who are there. The missions have their own brands. They'll have Indians who live at the missions work in ranching, work on rounding up cattle, branding the cattle. So we have this first story about ranching in Texas. There's no fences, so these cattle, I mean, they're essentially wild cattle anyways, and they get branded, you know, once or twice a year. They're roaming around. There are others who will claim these cattle. So as some of these settlements develop, whether we're talking about East Texas or the San Antonio area, or I'm going to talk also about some of the ranches in Nuevo Santander, what's going to happen is that other people will want access to those cattle because, you know, in some of these areas, they're far from markets, there's not developed economies, there's not a lot of opportunities. So cattle's the way to go. So the missionaries are already claiming those cattle. The king is going to say, those are my cattle. Anybody who kills them or brands them has to pay me, pay into this Mesteño fund, which is referenced in this translated document here. And then the settlers, the civilians who come in, they're saying, well, you know, you all wanted us to come and move out to the frontier. What are we supposed to do here? We have to have access to the cattle too. So it's very contentious. There are some angry letters that are written back and forth. And I'm making that story very short because it goes on for quite a while. What you see here, and this is a document from the Bear Archives, this is Ignacio Calvillo, who would own part of the Rancho de las Cabras for a while. He is petitioning to round up some horses with some other men, and then what he's going to have to do is pay for any unbranded cattle, right, and pay into this Misdenia fund, which is this royal treasury. So he's going about this the official way. Ignacio Calvillo, for a brief period of time, served as an alcalde. So he has an official government position, and while there were many people who apparently, we see this in the records, were rounding up and killing cattle without their brands and not paying into the fund, he is apparently following the law here. Okay. All right. And much as Deborah was talking about, I think the history of ranching in Texas has largely been told as a male story, and this is certainly the case when we look at Spanish Texas. And it's true, most of the ranchers in Spanish Texas were men, so that's part of the reason. When we look at the documents, when we look at the things that historians use, most of those government documents named the major ranchers as men, and there's a few women. You'll see the names coming into the documents at times. The síndicos. So there's an official title where there will be a rancher who's placed in charge of a ranching district, if you will, who keeps records on those ranches in the area. And those are always men, right? So this sort of hierarchy or power structure within these ranching communities are male, and that shouldn't surprise us. But the question I pose to you all is, what makes a rancher, right? When you're doing women's history, I think you have to look deeper into the documents. You have to ask some different questions. Owning land, does that make you a rancher? Well, I think we tend to think you have to have land, you know, for your animals to live on, to graze on. But the records from this era, there's many people who own quite a large number of livestock who don't have land. And they'll say, my cattle are grazing on my brother's land or on somebody else's land, and there are public lands, right? Owning livestock, okay, certainly, but how many? So the Spanish documents, they'll have lists of the major ranchers in the area, and then they'll say, these are people who own more than just a few animals. Okay, so it's vague, so I guess I can interpret that as I like. Yes, so owning more than just a few animals, because there are many people who might have, you know, 1 or 2 horses, a goat, you know, very small numbers. So something larger than that, certainly. They're breeding them, they're looking to increase the numbers. Having a brand. Brands were not required for cattle owners early in the Spanish period. They are later in the Spanish period. But we're going to find a lot of women who have brands, either registered in their own name or it's something they've inherited. So some women have multiple brands. And I put this other note here just at the end as another way to think about how the Spanish thought about the work of ranching, at least. You know, we see when the missionaries go to the missions and they are working to Hispanicize the Indians. They are imposing, when I say they, the missionaries are imposing their European ideas of gender roles, right, or gendered labor on the Indians, and they have the men work out on the ranches. You know, it's not the women who are doing this type of work. Okay. Again, I don't think that surprises us, but it's important to note here. Okay, a little bit more context. This is an image of Las Siete Partidas, which is the basis for the Spanish laws that will be important for women in this period of time. So Spanish law allowed women to own property. They could bring property into a marriage and maintain it as their own. There were community property laws so that everything a husband and wife earned in a marriage belonged to them equally. There were inheritance laws that said that all children, all legal heirs, had to inherit fairly equally. So no one heir can inherit more than like 1/3 to 1/5 of an estate. All of these things are really important for the women I'm going to talk about here. Most of them will be inheriting property, bringing property into marriages, maintaining it as their own. Okay, that's the law, that's what's on the books. Does this actually happen? I can tell you from my research and prior research where I looked at San Antonio, I looked at some communities in New Mexico and northern Mexico, especially the Saltillo area. It certainly was the case. Women own property, they're listing in their wills what they brought into the marriage, they're listing what's community property, and they're passing on property to their children. And most of the time, the men in particular tend to say everything will be divided equally by my heirs. The women might be a little bit more specific, but in the end, it does look pretty equal. All right, the other piece of context that's important here, mortality rates. Widowhood is a really common experience for women. I just grabbed some different pages from census documents. I think both of the ones I'm showing are from San Fernando de Bejar, of course later San Antonio. But what you'll notice in red, how many widows there are. Many of these women are widowed at a young age. Many of them have young children. I can show you another one from 1792. And you see the number of widows. And this is just, I mean, you can, almost any page in the census documents from this time, you'll find large numbers of widows. Some of these women who are listed as wives of men have been widowed before, and they've remarried. And that's the point, the snapshot we're getting at that time in the census document. This is a really common experience. The reason that's important, again, is because they're going to be inheriting some land. There's a lot, these are obviously rich documents, and I'm pulling out the information on widows, but I see y'all reading them. I know there's a lot of interesting stuff about ethnicity and families, too. Okay, so I want to tell just a few stories here to sort of get at what Deborah was talking about, that there's so many of these stories that should be told that we probably don't know about. And with some of these, especially Maria del Carmen Calvillo, I feel like, you know, I'm here to spread her story. I think it's tremendously important. In San Antonio in the late 1770s, the second largest cattle owner in the area was Maria Ana Corbelo, who owned Las Mulas Ranch, second largest cattle owner. At the same time, so 1770s, the woman who owned the fifth largest number was Leonor Delgado. So we have some evidence there. Looking at another area, I want to move down to South Texas. Now, in the Spanish period, this area I'm going to talk about was not part of Texas. It was Nuevo Santander. But if I don't talk about it when we talk about Texas, I think nobody talks about it. It gets neglected. And she is fascinating and tremendously important. She lived from 1752 to 1803. She inherited the La Feria land grant from her husband and father-in-law around 1790. She increased her land holdings by applying for land grants. And this is interesting. She does this in the name of her male relatives and then either has them transfer land to her once they get the title, or she's listed as a co-owner of these properties. All right, so what's happening here? Yes, these women could own land. Yes, they can apply for grants and get land given to them. But one of the things we're going to see is that a lot of times when these women appear in public or in public documents, if they have a husband or a brother or a father, they will either be there with them or doing the paperwork for them.
Is Bailly related to Father Bailly?
Yes. So her son was Nicolas Bailly, or Padre Bailly, right, who South Padre Island was named after. That would be part of her lands. Yeah, so she becomes a huge landowner. At the time of her death, she owns, they say, over 500,000 acres in largely the Rio Grande Valley. South Padre Island, of course, would be named after her son. Some of these lands are in modern-day Mexico. Nuevo Santander today, of course, is South Texas as well as parts of Tamaulipas. Yeah, so her story, I think, is really, really important. And so the name Bayi, have most of you all heard that name before? Okay, yeah, I mean, it depends. I think people who are from the valley have heard that name. I feel like I meet more and more descendants of the Bayis or Hinojosas every day. But this is also a story, an early story in women's history that isn't widely told, right? This is one of the foundational stories, I think, of the settlement of South Texas. That should be in all the textbooks, and more work needs to be done there. Maria del Carmen Calvillo is another one, and I'm going to move back to the San Antonio area for her story. So her father, I've already introduced you to him, Ignacio Calvillo. He would lease the land around Mission Espada. This is where Rancho de las Cabras is, near Floresville today. He ends up getting the title to that land by the early 1800s, and he rises in importance in the community largely through his marriage to his wife, who was an Orocha, a Canary Islander, and also came from important ranching families. In 1814, Ignacio Calvillo dies in that attack. And I should say, I didn't explain the attack. In the attack on the ranch that led to Maria inheriting the ranch. So if you were in the other session that's going on right now, this would make a little bit more sense. This is in the aftermath of the Battle of Medina. There's increased raids by Indians, especially Lipan Apaches, on outlying ranches. And purportedly, Lipan Apaches were part of this raid, although there's some other stories that say maybe a grandson was also involved. Ignacio Calvillo is killed in this raid, and Maria, as the eldest surviving child, inherits this ranch. It's a large property. I should also note, she is married at the time, but she's already calling herself a widow. Her husband had left, she's fascinating. 1811 or so, her husband had left because he proclaimed support for Mexican independence too early. And he had to leave. And when he left, she starts to call herself a widow, even though he's alive, and he ends up coming back to San Antonio, and he dies in 1825. But in any event, she calls herself a widow, so I will, and she will run this ranch on her own throughout her entire life. They had children, but her children died at a young age, and she does adopt 2 orphans. So they are, later in her life there to help out. This ranch, I don't want to run out of time here. There are a lot of animals. There's a lot of archaeological work that's been done at this site, which also helps us to tell this story. And there's a lot of evidence to indicate the work that was done at the time she owned it and the expansion. Also during her life, in 1814, she filed a petition to gain another piece of land in Wilson County, and I can show you that in just a minute. She holds on to most of this land until the 1840s when she sells it to Edward Dwyer, and that's another story. I'll come back. I have some images to show you in just a minute, but a little bit other evidence here. This is from another will from a San Antonio woman, and this is quite common. So this woman this is one of the Hoyos, noting she owns part of the ranch of San Bartolome, and she later talks about some of the livestock she has, that she and her husband acquired during their marriage, so it's community property. And then she also notes that her husband's siblings have an interest in this land. So this type of evidence is common. El Paso del Norte, again, this isn't actually Texas during this period of time. It's not actually Texas now either, but because El Paso del Norte is really Ciudad Juarez, like this part that I'm talking about at this period of time. But again, if I leave it out from Texas history, nobody will talk about it. We also have evidence from wills in particular of women who had ranches, who had a lot of land, and who had a lot of livestock. And you note that in particular with Juan Antonio Perez Velarde, who talked about what his wives brought into the marriage. The ganado mayor would be the cattle, the larger animals, and the menor would be the sheep and the goats. And I showed this image at the beginning of my talk. There's not much that's left there now, but you can see evidence of human occupation with that stone wall. You know, they did the digs and they covered everything back up. These are some items that were found in the digs. So we have some iron pieces that you can see here. We have some jewelry. All of these things would have been rather rare on the frontier, indicating her level of wealth, her status. They think, I should add, that one of those rings probably belonged to Maria Calvillo. This is a document from the GLO that shows that second piece of land in Wilson County. It wasn't Wilson County at the time, today Wilson County, that Maria applied for. There it is again. This is really fun. On the GLO website, you can go and play around with the GIS map, and if you zoom in, wherever you want to look at, you can find the original land grants. And I had this one already saved, this image, but when I went to do Bailly, when I was putting my PowerPoint together, the GIS map wasn't working that day, or they were working on it on the website. So I had to pull a document that was already made, and this one's not fantastic because it doesn't show all of the Bailly lands. In fact, La Feria would be to the right of Llano Grande there in yellow. But these colored pieces of land and many of the others have the name Bailly, and many of these Rosa Maria Hinojosa de Bailly would have inherited. And I'll leave this up here if you're interested in the topic and want some titles. In closing here, I think what's important to note, Maria Calvillo, for example, some of you all know the work that I do, and you've heard me talk about her before. That Rancho de las Cabras is part of the missions. It's part of the National Park Service, part of the World Heritage Site. As such, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for San Antonio and for the National Park Service to tell this important story, to tell women's history, to tell about women's involvement in ranching. So, that's something I hope to see in the future. There's also a lot of opportunity at that site to do something interpretive. And the story of Bailly and some of these other women that I just sort of flew through and mentioned. These are stories that I think really changed the narrative of early Texas history, of Spanish Texas history. They're important, they're interesting, especially Bailly and Calvillo, and some of the others I haven't dived into yet. I'm sure they're fascinating stories and they deserve to be told. So I'll stop there so that we have time for questions.
How far was Rancho de las Cabras from San Jose? For Mission San Jose?
Oh, it's further than Mission Espada, but still it's within a day's ride.
A day's ride?
Yeah,
It wasn't
yes.
like a walkable hour?
No. Right.
You have to have permission from the National Park Service to go on site.
Right.
They do tours, but it has to be scheduled. You have to sign on to the log. I don't know what the status is since COVID, but that was, before COVID, that was the requirement.
Right. I did one of those tours. They used to do it one Saturday a month or something, but now I think you have to set it up with them. And you have to drive through like some really rough, like you can't take my little sedan out there. It'll get messed up.
I was wondering how you and Dr. Lyles kind of came to your research. What were some of the things that you perhaps found that made you want to dig a little deeper hearing Dr. Lyles?
Is Deborah still here with us? Or I can talk about mine. The piece on Maria Calvillo is actually really, oh, she is, okay, good. It's old research for me. I started it, I wrote my senior honors thesis when I was in college on Maria Calvillo. And it was so long ago, I don't even exactly remember how I found her, but I knew I wanted to write on Spanish Texas. I was a history and Spanish major, interested in those topics, and I was interested in women's history. And I think back then you had to go to the microfilms, but you just start looking through, and if you're interested in women's history, you start looking at the court cases, the land records, the census documents, and once you've read through a lot of those, you start to see some patterns. Right? I'll let Deborah go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Would you mind repeating it for me?
I can tell you, Deborah. The question was, how did you come to your research? How did you become interested in it?
I transcribed property tax records for 3 full years, going from 1845 to 1865 and plotting them on Excel, in Excel documents. And numbers talked to me, and I could start seeing the patterns emerge. And for me, it was about slave owners and people who owned livestock. So it wasn't everybody in the whole picture. So I missed a lot of stories. But you can see the stories emerge with, for example, with Martha, how, her numbers would consistently go up, and here she was, a woman. And I highlighted all the women I found in the tax records in pink, and noticed that there were a lot of stories that we're not catching. And then from there, I went to the census records, and you start going through those and recognizing the terms that they used at those times. So stock racers would be one of them. They never called themselves ranchers in those days. And so you can start seeing and then start comparing tax records and census records. And it's definitely minutia, but that's how you catch these stories that don't ever get told.
Sorry, everybody. Since we went over at the lunch hour, we're trying to get back on our schedule. Thank you, Debbie, for all your hard work, and Amy. And it's really a pleasure to see these stories coming out. My own great-grandmother was Salome Bailly, and her story was largely lost because of, the French torching, what would you say, different archives of state. That didn't help. And so anyway, it's time that we piece back together the story of these brave women. So thank you all. We'll see you at the next session. We've got our other panelists ready to go, and thank you very much.